So it is my privilege and pleasure to introduce all of you to Ash Maurya. Ash, if you're on, can you turn on your video? And great to see you.
Hello, everyone.
Good. So it's so nice to put a face to the name. And Ash needs no introduction to people in products, building products, and product management, right? He is a well-recognized thought leader and very influential person in global startup space. He's very prolific in my view, and I've been influenced by Ash a lot, especially Ash with your first book, Running Lean. And I think something that had actually imprinted on me is life is too short to build something that nobody wants, right? I think that's so true. We spend so much time, energy, effort in trying to build products without pausing and asking that question. So, he's an author of 2 successful best-selling books, Running Lean and Scaling Lean, more recently. He's also creator of Lean Canvas, which is an amazing stack, if you will, a SaaS. And by the way, I think this is fascinating, Ash. We would like to hear from you. And I don't know if I'm interpreting this right. You seem to want to repurpose your work that you're creating in multiple forms, right? So you started off writing blogs and then converted that into books, and then started building SaaS product around that. And more recently, would love to hear what your new venture is. But you're also a pretty successful entrepreneur. So my first question is on that. Do you repurpose, or do you do that with the intent of repurposing? And which, if so, what is the thought process behind that? And the second one is, it took 6 years for the second book to come out. I've been, waiting for it. Now, 6 years is a pretty long term in our industry, as you know it, right? But just wanted to ask you if Scaling Lean has a lot more frameworks, a lot more tools that people can use after product market fit, right? So over to you. Again, excited to have you on the call today.
Sure. And I also wanted to see if I could get permission to share my screen.
Sure. You can just go. I think you're co-host.
Okay, perfect.
Yep.
So I'll throw that on there, and I'll start by answering the question. So thank you all for being here, and thank you, Sai, for the warm introduction. So going back to the question, yes. So I've been an entrepreneur many years, and my process was really not a master plan of writing books and doing what I'm doing now. I was trying to figure things out like everyone else. So my blog was the place where I started asking questions and holding myself accountable. So I was really sharing my stories of product development along the years. And that turned into an audience that accidentally turned into a book, Lean Canvas. So that's how I stumbled in. But as to the repurposing, I ran into a quote many years ago from Kathy Sierra, where she said, don't fall in love with X, fall in love with the user of X. So don't fall in love with your product, fall in love with the customers. And that was a eye-opening thing. Many years ago, if you asked me what I did, I would define myself by my product category. So I'm in software or I'm in services. But today, as you can see, I've written books, we build a SaaS product. We once considered even doing a board game. So when we think of helping the customer, in this case for us, entrepreneurs, innovators, the solutions are really not that relevant. We are kind of category agnostic, so we will build what it takes. So we have a mix of services and products, which to me is at the end all the same. So those that are familiar with kind of a jobs to be done type of thinking, that I found also a very empowering way of thinking. So there is ultimately trying to build a better innovator is the job, and how you do that is where the solution of the product comes in. And so having a multi-product mindset is helpful. So my process has been, start at product A, which was for me a blog. Maybe that turns into a book. Maybe it turns into tools. I run workshops. I test. So a lot of testing, a lot of continuous testing happens along the way, and that's how the products get better. So every product I build since the beginning has gone through that trajectory. As to the books, the first book very much was focused on the innovator that's trying to get a minimum viable product out. So what's that process of first product, not falling in love with solutions, but trying to find a path towards building what customers want. We'll get into some of those here today. The second book, though, was answering yet more questions. So once the first book got written, as is normal, more questions emerge. And the second book is a lot about this idea of traction, or this idea of communicating what is working. In the early stages, as we all know, very challenging to be profitable, very challenging to talk about ROI because you're really in the stage. And so the challenge there is, how do we really communicate our big ideas to investors and stakeholders? And that's what the Scaling Lean book was fundamentally all about.
Thank you.
Let me get
that. Yeah, thanks for answering that. Please get on. We can now move on to your presentation.
All right. So what I want to talk about today is set some context. So I know some of you might be familiar with maybe some of the work or the tools, but I feel that it's important to talk about what has fundamentally changed. So we're kind of living in this new world. The way we have built products has changed over the years. Some of you have lived through maybe some of these transitions. The first point I want to make is that we don't really change from one way of building products to the other simply because we get bored or some thought leaders come along. It's often in reaction to the way markets and customers behave. So just going back in time, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, it's not a history class, but going back in time, a lot of the, 100 years ago, we were in this factory era. So it was all about manufacturing efficiencies, and unfair advantages came to those that could build products at the least cost. So it was essentially about profit and efficiency. As we moved into waterfall with the kind of the digital revolution, what began to happen was building products using this staged approach. And again, many of us have lived through this type of product development cycle, and it looks a lot like this. So we start off with requirements. There's a big middle where we go away trying to build, analyze, execute. So execution was the name of the game. And being able to manage a project from beginning to end was ultimately what differentiated good products from other products. This got challenged as we moved into the PC era because things started to move faster. It was no longer enough to go away for 2 years and then do a big, big software or big product launch. This started what eventually became Agile. So in the early 1990s, there were many frameworks popping up, extreme programming and others. And those got codified into what became Agile. And the name of the game there was managing change. So it was all about iterative development. And again, many of us have lived through that transition. So notice the stages don't really change. We still have to get requirements from customers. We still have to build. We still have to release. We still have to do market validation. But there are more touch points in Agile. Then the world changed again. So as we moved into the internet era, which we are now very much in, as we stopped building products and shipping them in boxes, and we're delivering services and a lot of things online, it became increasingly important to go even faster. So even now, cycle times, you look at some companies who do this at scale, they're continuously delivering, they're continuously deploying. Lots of things are being tested. So that's kind of the new world that we're living in. And that sparked in the early 2009, 2010 timeframe, what eventually became the Lean Startup movement and what we are now calling this idea of continuous innovation. Yeah. So to contrast that, this is what that picture looks like. So again, the stages are the same, but notice that in the bottom, Lean Startup Continuous is all squashed in. So speed of implementation or speed of learning is the new game here. Now, again, these transitions, as I said, happened not because some folks came in and said that's what we need to do, but fundamentally customer behavior was changing, customer demand was changing. The other thing that's been happening is we are living in this global entrepreneurial renaissance. I have been traveling around the world for the last 10 years, and everywhere I go, I see startups popping up, and India is no different. And not just startups, but you're seeing this product renaissance where lots of people are moving into product development. This is an interesting number. So in 2018, I don't have the 2019 number, there were 100 million startups that popped up. That's a big, scary number. If we bring this down, that's 3 startups a second. So if I stop for 3 seconds, we've got another startup coming up. Now, I want to be very clear, these are not successful startups, but these are maybe 2-3 people coming around the kitchen table saying, let's do something, let's launch a product. And of course, what has enabled this is we have not equal access, but we have a flatter world, more equal access thanks to the internet, cloud computing, all the technologies we have in front of us, cheaper and faster to build products, launch a product from anywhere. So all these things are what has enabled this. Now, of course, when you've got these many ideas out there, it has a flip side. So we also see another thing happening, which is the pace of disruption has increased. So a lot of these companies, which were household names, many of these brands we knew, I grew up with many of these, are no longer with us. This has been happening, and the rate at which this is happening has been increasing. On the other spectrum, we find companies that are some of the more valuable companies on the stock market or in the product world. They think very differently. So they have this notion of continuously testing their ideas. So the way you find your next big idea is not through analysis, but through a lot of continuous testing. Now, when we saw Lean Startup kind of emerge in the early days, these were some of the startups that were poster startups that we were using as examples. Dropbox, Airbnb. Most of you should know who they are. Massive billion-dollar companies in a very short time frame. But what I want to also highlight is that the idea of continuous innovation, the idea of experimentation, goes back even before that. So that's the other thing to realize, is that frameworks come into play, but they're often trying to codify what people are seeing happening already. So when Lean Startup came on the stage, we were using these examples. So companies like Amazon, companies like Facebook, they had been internalizing this notion of rapid experimentation. If you look at this code, at any given point in time, Facebook has probably 10,000 different versions running. They're running 10,000 A/B tests, every single day, and they can do this because they have massive scale. So I don't want to scare everyone out there, because it will take time for others to get to the scale, but you don't have to. So the point of all of this, if we look at other examples, there are companies here that aren't maybe running 10,000 experiments a day, but they are still internalizing this idea of experimentation to finding what really works. And what is kind of interesting or empowering with leaders like that, both Jeff Bezos, Amazon, and a lot of the folks here, is that they're telling their product folks that we as leaders, can set direction. We have a vision, we have goals, but we may not know what customers need. We may not know what to build. We have to discover that. So that's fundamentally what's different in a lot of this. So the common thread in all of these companies that I just showed you is that they are essentially internalizing this notion of speed of learning. So speed of learning has become the new unfair advantage. And speed is relative. So when I say go fast, I'm not saying go at Facebook scale. Even if you're a car company like Tesla, if you can launch a car, which they did in 2.5 years, compared to other car companies that take 10 years to launch, that's moving at light speed. And they also were a startup not too long ago. They came out of nowhere and they've made a lot of noise. So we'll have to see if they stick around, but they were able to come and think differently and really execute quite well. So that's a bit of the context of where we have been. What I want to spend the rest of the time doing is sharing with you some answers to this question. So Lean Startup, for many of you who have been following this, popped on the scene about 10 years ago. We're almost in the 10-year anniversary. But when we look around, we don't find this in common practice. A lot of people internalize the principles, understand the ideas, but we don't see this in common practice. And some of the reasons for this is essentially this picture right here, is that whenever we have shifted from one way to another way, we find some teams, usually the product teams, move forward, but others kind of lag behind. Business planning kind of still stays stuck in the old way. Those of you that practice Agile today probably know what I'm talking about. We really practice Wagile, waterfall disguised as Agile, where sometimes our stakeholders will say, you can iterate your way, but make sure you build these things by these timeframes. So that's essentially waterfall, but we can iterate our way towards those products. That doesn't work also well here, because a lot of continuous innovation, a lot of lean startup type thinking is fundamentally challenging our beliefs around the business model. And so we'll see some of the pitfalls here and some of the tools that are in place to start thinking that way. So I have been very much a practitioner myself. A lot of what got my attention in the early days were some of the core principles, a lot of the mindsets that were different, and I started to see products differently. I shared an example just earlier, don't fall in love with your solution, fall in love with your customers and their problems. That has changed the way I look at what I build. But there are many other such mindsets. And if you are trying to get good at this kind of thinking, a lot of people focus on the skills. They might pick up a lean canvas or pick up A/B testing. Those are all good, but you have to understand the why. So that's what this is trying to emphasize, is start with mindsets. Don't just use these tools. Understand why you're doing it, get your stakeholders involved, and then kind of level up, start building the skills, and then the playbooks will start to change. How you build products changes quite a bit. So I want to talk about some of the challenges, why the old way doesn't work, and why fundamentally there has to be some new thinking here. So many of you, I'm guessing, are in different stages. You're all kind of product leaders, but have maybe lived through this question. You've had an idea, promising new idea, but then you're asked to go and do the analysis. So show me the business case or the business plan, do the financial forecast, write the 18-month product roadmap. And nothing wrong with these things if we had lots of time to do analysis. But when you're moving really fast, it's not that people are lazy and don't want to do the work. It's that a lot of these things for new products are simply unknowable. So you don't really know who the markets are. You have to go in and discover that. But let's say you're determined, you go and do a lot of these, and maybe actually this is what happens. So there are a lot of folks who don't go through this process and their ideas never get selected because they either are too risky or they just aren't able to show evidence that this is going to work because we just don't know what we don't know in the beginning. But let's assume that you are determined, you go and do your business case, you go and do your business plan. The challenge we run into next is this execution mindset. And this again comes from the waterfall approach, where we have got these elaborate forecasts and product roadmaps, and we are held accountable to them. So in 6 months, we better build things on time and on budget. The problem, of course, is that when we launch, if what we build is not what customers want, it goes back to the life's too short to build what nobody wants, then that isn't really progress in my book. All we have proven is that we have built something nobody wants on time and on budget. So we want to kind of avoid this trap. And this is where we just blindly get into the execution mindset. And we'll talk about some counter ways to overcome this. The last challenge we run into is the big idea challenge. So when we are trying to find big ideas, companies will usually try to do a lot of analysis up front and put their investments in a few ideas at a time. And the problem with that is that we then invest only in the safe ideas, the one that seem most promising. But if you look at every one of these unicorn startups, every one of these big ideas, they all sound crazy at first. Even in the Amazon example, as big as they are, when Jeff Bezos was launching AWS, which we all know and love, a lot of his own stakeholders, his own shareholders said, what are you doing? You are in the book business, you are in the retail business. Why should you be going into this Amazon Web Services? And they did that, and that's a multi-billion-dollar business unit in the company. So for every one of those, of course, there are ideas that didn't go anywhere in Amazon, and they do this all the time. But as Jeff Bezos says, when you're kind of hitting, you've got to hit for the fences. Some ideas will go out of the ballpark, and some of them will not. But you have to be hitting for the fences. So let's kind of see. So the message here is that some of these old approaches of tools weren't really built for speed. And it comes down to basically this problem here, is when you're dealing with a lot of speed, when there's a lot of uncertainty in the new products you're trying to launch, when there's lots of competition, we need more dynamic thinking. We need more adaptive thinking, more evolutionary type of thinking than static plans and execution. So that's what I want to kind of build up here next. Traditionally, when we have been asked to do business planning or business case planning, that's kind of an old world tool, and it did have its place. So of course it worked in a time when there wasn't a lot of competition, where you could afford to spend 6 months doing analysis, another 6 months to 9 months building and launching a product. And even if release 1.0 was not quite up to par, where would the customers go? You had this relationship with your customers, you could go and improve on that. So customers had a lot of loyalty to you because they had built this relationship with you. Today, the world is very different. And it's not just in B2C, we see this in B2B as well. When you look at typical enterprise software, there's a lot of SaaS alternatives and people are picking and choosing, and the loyalty is very fickle. So if your product starts to fall behind, there's another 20, 30 options to pick from. Yeah. And so it's become a lot more competitive. And so we have to embrace this idea of speed. Now, the way that we do this is not through the elaborate business planning, but rather this notion of the business model. So Sai mentioned the lean canvas, but that's one of the tools here. It's not the only model out there, but it's one of the tools to deconstruct one's idea. So some planning is always required. You can't just go out there and build something without knowing what you want to do. If you were building a house, you have to have some kind of a sketch or blueprint. So this is where a tool like this comes in play. If you've never seen the lean canvas, you can quickly scan this, and a lot of the boxes should be familiar. This is a one-page tool that you can use to tell the story of your idea. So who is the customer? What's their problem? What are they using today? Why is that not up to par? What solution might you build? What value proposition would you lead with? So it starts to ask a bunch of questions, and it's a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. You start with one. You can start with any box. We recommend starting with not your solution, although a lot of innovators do that, but start with what, who would use your solution? What problems are you really solving? And then look for evidence of that. If you aren't really solving a problem for your customer, you have bigger problems. So that's kind of how we use this tool to do that kind of discovery work. So this is a one-page kind of model that helps you going. And this maybe is the first mindset. I used to be a technical engineer, software engineer. So definitely I always placed a lot of emphasis on the solution. I loved all my solutions. They all seemed amazing in the beginning. But one of the mindsets over the years was not falling in love just with the solution. Solutions are important, but you have to think of the business model fundamentally as a product. Now, when you are, this in itself, I know a lot of folks here are product folks, so this will resonate. If you are building a very hard technical product, you don't start with the easiest things. The easiest things you can do anytime. Good project management tells us we should start with the riskier assumptions first. If you think of the business model as a product, that's the next principle here. Don't start with the easiest things like building what you can build, because technical feasibility, if it's proven, you don't have to prove it out again. The bigger challenge here is maybe market feasibility or customer desirability. So those are the things we want to do. So the second principle here is start with not what's easiest, but what's riskiest. And it goes back to this point that we oftentimes, because we fall in love with our solutions, we spend needless time, money, and effort building the wrong product. And we can just reverse this. So rather than starting with solution, if you start with some of the other boxes, that's where we have a much better chance of success. Now, I call this the innovator's bias. It's a very common condition. We all have it. Anyone who loves product loves their solution box, but you have to subject that to a question. You have to ask yourself, let me go, before I invest 6 months, 9 months, a year of my life building this, let's go and do some discovery work. Let's go and see, is there evidence for customers struggling with some problem that my solution can address? So we want to avoid the build and then figure out, does this work? We can actually, with a lot of techniques we have developed over the years, do a lot of desirability testing, interest-based testing, and sell before you build. So think of any product that you're building. We normally would build it, demo it, and then sell it. What if you flip that around? What if we instead build a demo, not the full product, sell that demo, because that's typically how the sales process works. If nobody buys the demo, why even build this product? So it sounds very commonsensical, but up until now, we have always thought technical feasibility was the biggest risk. But what we are learning is that today we are gotten very good at building products. It's more about market and customer feasibility and viability than technical. So the risks have kind of changed. So this is the second meta principle. So don't start with what's easiest, start with what's riskiest. And then the last part over here is this idea of still testing your risky assumptions. Just because you and I think that something is risky doesn't necessarily mean that we can think our way out of that risk. We have to, again, experiment and test. This is where the lean startup kind of thinking really shines. Those of you that have seen this, this is the experiment loop, or the build, measure, learn loop. So rather than building lots of things, we can build a little bit of things and test them along the way. So that's where the iteration comes in. So involving customers. And again, in Agile, we do some of this, but we sometimes don't go far enough. We appoint product owners in a company, and the product owners play the role of the customer, but if they bring their biases in and they speak for the customer, that's not truly the customer voice. And even when we do customer validation, we oftentimes don't want to just measure what customers are saying, but rather what they're doing. A lot of customers will say, love your product, go build it. Sometimes that's a leading type of bias. It's essentially how you ask the question gives you the wrong kind of confirmation bias answer. The only true test is when you launch something, put it in their hands. Adoption or usage is how we really test whether something indeed is working. So this code kind of sums it all, is that in God we trust, all others bring data. And I know that this is a data conference, so that should be kind of something that you all already subscribe to. But this is where the truth lies. So we have to really look for data in all of these, and that helps us in making evidence-based decisions. Now, there is place for qualitative learning. So the thing with data is that data tells us verification-wise what has worked, and the qualitative helps us with sometimes the insights, like why has this worked? So I'm not saying just do one or the other. We kind of have to do both qualitative and quantitative type of experimentation of learning. But this essentially is the one-page kind of summary of what this method looks like. It's very much inspired by the scientific method. So much like a scientist, when we are trying to study something very difficult, we don't rush to run just experiments. We start with models. We use the models to make predictions. From those predictions, we can then see if our thinking was accurate. And if it wasn't, it's not really the fault of the experiment. It's really our thinking. So we can adjust that. And this is what we would call a sprint or a lean sprint, this cycle from left to right. And if you can do this pretty quickly, that's where the speed of learning kind of lives, where the speed of learning comes. So companies like Facebook at scale are doing this very, very quickly, multiple times a day. But even if you did a 2-week or 3-week sprint, where rather than building a product and then waiting to see does it really work, if you can increase your learning loops from customers, not from folks inside the company, but really going down to the customer level, the insights you get allow you to course correct and get your product on track. So this is, again, the summary. I want to cover maybe just a few more pieces here, and then we can kind of open up for questions. Yeah. This was the second problem that I kind of raised, which was the execution mindset. So again, in the old world, we would build a plan and then measure it based on outputs. Are we building on time, on budget? We'd use metrics like build velocity. In this new world kind of thinking, we have to look at outcomes. We have to look not just at what we have built, but what have we built, measured, and learned, and how do we learn that? The only true test we talked about was data, and the kind of data we're really looking for needs to be customer engagement type of data. So traction is ultimately the metric that matters, and being able to measure traction and communicate traction, even in the early scales, becomes very key. So companies like Facebook were able to convince their investors in very early days that they were onto something. Not because they had millions of users, they only had 100,000 active users, but they could show data on how those 100,000 active users were behaving at twice the performance of their closest competitors. And so that kind of leading indicator can now show your investors, show your stakeholders that you are indeed onto something, that you have hit an inflection point, you are building things that are outperforming other products out there, and then they can invest, they can double down on those early signals for your idea. So traction, again, is what we use to communicate leading indicators for profit and those financial metrics I was talking about. So in the early stages, we don't have profit, we don't have, we are all kind of net negative in terms of spend. So we have to communicate something else, and traction is essentially that answer. So that's how we would kind of generally look at that. Traction, as you can see, will vary depending on stage. We can break the product journey into 3 big stages. Problem solution fit is a lot about finding evidence of problems worth solving. And that's when it seemingly feels like nothing is happening, but this is where we are prioritizing which problems to go after, which markets to go after, looking for evidence of problems, big problems worth solving before jumping all in. So we kind of traditional requirements gathering, but it's doing there's some newer techniques, customer interviewing techniques, testing techniques where we can test for these types of things. Product market fit is where we build and launch our product. And this is where we are iterating. This is where we kind of have the most fun, because we are kind of iterating our way towards a product that starts to work well enough in the market. And then the scaling engine fit comes in. And this is where we start looking for engines of growth, and we are starting to kind of scale that business model. Now, if you kind of internalize these 3 steps, and we talk about testing lots of ideas, not a few ideas, I'm going to bring it all together with this idea or concept of the funnel. So the idea funnel is a powerful one, is that when you are testing, traditionally, we have tried to do a lot of analysis to find the best ideas to invest in and make a few big bets. In this new world, we have to make many small bets. So it's not about investing in ideas that are perfect, because we don't yet know what perfect is. And some of these ideas will not get very far. So the solutions to this kind of thinking is thinking of an idea funnel. Now, this sounds very simple, but it does require your stakeholders to kind of redefine what success means. There are companies like Google, now that they're Alphabet, they talk about moonshots. They give bonuses if you can walk into a room and disprove an idea. So if you're working on a project, they were working on this hot air balloon, and one of the engineers came in and said this would never work. And he went on the whiteboard and in 30 minutes proved that it would never work. And everyone agreed. And so they shut down the project, and he got a bonus check, right? So that's actually saving the resources of the whole team, but that requires different kind of thinking. Like in our world, the old world, we generally think if you go and try to kill a project, you're not being a team player. But this is a kind of a different mindset for these kinds of projects. And what we're trying to avoid is essentially this trap, is that today, very easy to generate ideas. The bigger problem is, which ideas do we really pick? We pick the safer ones, but the safer ones are not the ones that have these breakthrough insights. So this is kind of the slide that will show you kind of all these pieces coming together. So this might be what a continuous innovation funnel looks like. It's broken into the stages I talked about. So there's some business model design where we are using tools like the canvas to tell the story of our business. We then break the product launch not into a 2-year cycle, but maybe 3-month cycles or 6-month cycles. Those will vary in the kind of product you're building, but we're looking at evolution of ideas. We're using traction as the measure of progress, and we're creating some clear stages. So if we don't get traction, why should we build this? If we get evidence that customers don't want this, let's build something else instead. And in the early stages, it's really more about people and thinking than ideas. So it's not so much about trying to find the perfect idea, but really instill the right thinking processes. If you can come up with some big, bold ideas and you can invalidate them, that's actually healthy. That's actually healthy for finding the right products in the long run. So kind of in summary, I want to kind of share this because I know we've got a mix maybe of big companies, small companies, and maybe startups in the audience. But I like to share this for the big companies out there. And of course, the startups have generally more speed. They have less constraints. But in theory, if we think of this, a big company should never fail against a startup because they have all the resources. They have access to customers. The reason that startups struggle is that they struggle with channels. They find it hard to get in front of customers and do a lot of this kind of learning. But the reason that larger companies struggle is that they often build a lot of barriers to talking to their own customers. And I call this the curse of specialization. We will sometimes bring in folks who are talking to our customers, and yes, we might get the learning, but by the time it comes to the people building the products, we kind of have the elephant whisper happening, and it gets very morphed and garbled along the way. Now, I know that product management, product leadership is a new kind of field, and to me, I find that kind of very inspiring. You are the folks who can help in creating this kind of change. It's bringing the true voice of the customer, internalizing kind of metrics and qualitative learning, tools like the one we talked about, questioning even your own assumptions and challenging your own teams to test those assumptions. It can be done. It is not easy, and that's just why products are hard. They're simple ideas, but simple doesn't mean easy. There is going to be comfort zones that will be crossed. Not everyone is comfortable doing these kinds of things. You going in front of your team and saying, I believe customers want this, instead of I know customers want this. That subtle language changes kind of the scientific mindset versus one who is telling, kind of leading teams into a direction that they think they are absolutely certain about. So it is going to be a bit different. This is a picture of what Agile looked like in the early days. I was one of these engineers here who got pulled out of my comfortable cubicles and was asked to go into a war room like this one. Very uncomfortable. In the beginning, I thought I was being micromanaged. I was being asked to, be in this fishbowl and talk and do stand-ups every day. It seemed very weird, but we all practiced this. We all got over it. Same thing today. When you leave at 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. in the morning to go talk to a customer, that doesn't feel like work today, but this is where you get the biggest kinds of insights. So this is kind of the new uncomfortable loop. So it's the feedback loop that we can build with customers that will lead to kind of these big insights in our products. So that's kind of, I wanted to give you a big picture view of what the process was and some of these mindsets, and happy to open up to questions that you might have.
Yep, absolutely. I think, very succinct, to the point, very prescriptive way of thinking about these things, Ash, very typical of you and your work that we've seen. And I think, to the point that you mentioned about large enterprises, and I think large companies have, are now much more open in adopting the lean principles and lean methodologies within smaller teams, compared to where it was 2-3 years ago. And I went through this transformation within my own team in the previous organization. So it is not anymore. I mean, earlier it used to take a lot of evangelizing, but many people now realize that this is a better way. This is a less risky way to do that. But there are a lot of questions on the thread, so I'll get to that. But before that, you made a statement which I thought I will ask the team to create a quick poll, a little bit provocative, and to see how the audience responds to that, just to get a sense of what they think about the statement that you made, and see, and also would let you comment on or give some examples of how this is even possible, right? Yeah. Many people, especially not in the product management world and not in the lean and iterative approach, and especially focusing on experiments, taking it to the customer and getting it done, can believe this, that you can actually get a paying customer without even having a product, right? Sure. So I'm glad the audience here agrees that it is possible, but if you have one or two examples, then, it'll illuminate.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I guess we can see that, there's 70% of you saying absolutely companies do this all the time. Yeah. And first of all, if we just break this down to even the sales process, like if you were building a big product, the sales process often starts with a demo. So you actually the customer doesn't get to use a product before they buy. They look at a demo, they need proof that this works. So you have to lead with what we call an offer. So an offer is essentially your value proposition. It's a demo, and then it's usually pricing. Yeah. And if all that checks out, they might then do a pilot and those types of things. So the mindset here is that you can start by doing that kind of offer testing with platforms like on the B2C side, with platforms like Kickstarter and crowdfunding. We see a lot of that happening. So that already happens where people are willingly buying before something is built and even funding that. But even in B2B sales, we see this a lot, is that you can, in the process of selling a product, really understand customer needs, really then even further come back to them and say, what we demoed you, maybe not the right thing. Can we build a dialogue with you and figure out the right product to build? So it happens all the time. We've had people go in and build things just with mock-ups and screenshots, define the product they need to build, get customer commitment, letters of intent, even advance payment, and then go off and build that rather quickly. Yeah. You do have to pick the right early adopters, because your big tier 1 customers may not be engaging you that way. So you have to start with different types of customers, but very much possible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, so I was just going through the set of questions that are there, and there is a pattern here. And this resonates with what happens even in the context of some of the IPL programs, right? So in one of the IPL program, there is a concept called product labs, right? Which is essentially the participants pick their business idea, sketch out a business model, right? Whether using a lean canvas or the BMC, the business model canvas, and then pick each of the box and get out of the building, create experiments and test them, right? So first of all, it's a very uncomfortable situation for a lot of people, because majority of the folks, and even on this audience, I would presume that they come from big multinational companies, big enterprises, right? So the notion that you forget about solution for a minute, right? Focus on your customer, focus on the problem. Is the problem real? Is the problem urgent? All of that, which means go and gather evidence, is kind of jarring and also counterintuitive, right? So, and of course, they go through this process for all the boxes, most of the boxes, right? So, which is a fascinating, revealing exercise to oneself, saying that I thought this idea is awesome, but then I don't see evidence of somebody wanting this, right? And that's very important. And you, to your articulation, not only now, but in your books, that, you know, reduce the risk upfront before you build that. Now, the question is around, you know, how can we take this approach in, number one, in large enterprises, right? Now, isn't that got to do with the culture of the organization, right? Yep. The second one is, can this be applied to all products in all stages of life cycle, including maturity, or only during the early stages of life cycle? I think these two is always coming up, right? And of course, you know, while we discuss this in the context of the program and the product labs that you, we would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. So I'll go back to this slide, because I'll come back to the point below on some solutions for overcoming the talking to customers part. But I'll start with the stage. So we find the early adopters in large enterprises to be more of the emerging products, simply because one of the challenges here is habit change. If you have an established product, there's a lot of reputation, brand, systems are in place. To go there and shake things up can be, there's just more inertia in doing that. So we need to get stakeholders on board. They have to buy into this funnel type of thinking, which is, instead of giving big budgets, you know, year-long budgets, go and analyze and build, let's do some of this kind of innovation lab stuff, like you were saying, product lab type of thinking. So we have to get stakeholders involved. That usually is step one. Step number two, I find when I go into big companies, is I actually tell them, you know, let's go and find these new revenue sources, these emerging ideas that are very risky. Nobody wants to touch them, because those ones are the ones where there's a lot of uncertainty, where this process really shines. If I go and challenge, if I try to cannibalize an existing product, I'm not going to create friends, I'm going to create enemies. Because again, a large organization has antibodies, you know, we fight, we try to preserve status quo, we preserve the business model, rightly so. And so you kind of get a lot of internal politics, you know, departments get into rivalries and things. So I actually say, leave us alone and let's go and find new markets. So that usually is where you can prove this working. And then gradually, so in the Horizon model, McKinsey came up with this model of Horizon 1, 2, 3. The concept there is look for those emerging, uncertain ideas. You can test this stuff working there. And if the company starts to then see some benefits, the culture can start to change gradually. You can then migrate into kind of the other stages here. I did want to go back to this. So we did do a project with Cisco, and this is the slide I led with. And this was actually, I got brought in because there was an entrepreneurial team of 2 that went in and built this product without permission. They got an early adopter customer to use it, you know, broke some rules, and got a bit, you know, big scolding, because they didn't ask for permission. They kind of asked for forgiveness, which a lot of entrepreneurs do. But Cisco said, you know, why are you guys doing this? You know, we should build the culture. Like, we actually want more people to do what you did, but not behind backs of managers. You know, we should do this openly. And so we kind of dug in deeper, and what we found is that there were a lot of these hurdles. If you're an engineer, how do you even talk to customers? You know, if you ask a salesperson to help you, they protect their accounts. It's like, why do you want to talk to this customer? They're my customer. So you get a lot of this kind of stuff happening. Legal, if you want to install something on premises, you have to go through, you know, 20-page NDAs, mutual NDAs, all these legal documents to happen. Engineers can't do that. So you can't just pick up the phone and rapidly test. But what, in credit of Cisco, what they did is they took a lot of this and they went back and they found, for these types of projects, can we go to sales and get a short list of early adopters of customers who can be on our advisory board, where we already have quick, you know, mutual NDAs for how we can work on risky ideas. Those are ways that larger companies can make legal a lot faster. They can make finding customers a lot faster for the engineers and designers, so that they can do that kind of rapid testing. You know, create sandbox environments, a lot of things that can be done with your best early adopter customers, where you can allow product folks to go out there and really do rapid testing.
Great. So just to summarize, two things are required in a large enterprise setup, right? One is evangelizing, which is, either you, which is individuals, need to have the requisite understanding of this methodology, the benefits of it, articulate that to the leadership teams or sponsors or anything to help them see the benefit of it. Number one, which is a continuous process, right? Which also requires the individuals themselves to understand the skill better and also communicate that. Second thing is, this is a pretty, I think, very insightful one, which is identify new revenue streams that are inherently deemed as risky by the existing stakeholders. And so there is less resistance to let that be subjected to this experimentation. And so you can then go and do the experiments and also bring in some early adopter customers through the existing channel or sales under a very protective construct, right? So these are two things that you're suggesting. Excellent. One more question that I would pick is, I think from an industry perspective, right? So while this methodology and approach seems pretty well tuned to digital products or software products, how about, does this even apply to industries like automotive or aerospace or healthcare, right? Soumya is asking this question. So
sure. Yeah. So in the early days, I came from a digital background, and I used to tell people that yes, you can move really fast, but in these other products, the principles are the same. Tactics are sometimes different, and cycle times can be a bit different. At the same time, if you look at the first few stages here, that's why I went to the funnel picture, but business model design and problem solution fit. In problem solution fit, we aren't really testing or building the feasibility of the product. We aren't really building. We're trying to see, can we even go in and convince a customer with the demo that this is worth doing? That's precisely what Tesla did. So I'll use that example. So Tesla is a car company. When Elon Musk took the stage, he led with a big value proposition, which is, we as a company want to build an all affordable electric car. Are you interested? And they got lots of interest. Lots of people said, yes, we'd want to buy it. He showed mock-ups and people said, yes, we'll buy it. He said, if you want this car, he put up a picture of their Roadster, which was the first car, started taking pre-orders, right? Those were all examples of things. Now, behind the scenes, he had to work with his team to make sure that we can indeed launch this. So my point with that is that even though the launch in their case was 2 years later, a lot of that early phase of problem solution fit can really be done with any kind of product. It doesn't have to be digital, it could be physical. I mean, if we take this to the extreme, you've got both, Richard Branson, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, they're selling tickets to Mars. I mean, you can buy a ticket to go to space, right? So they have these one day that's going to be sold. So you can sell that upfront and prove that there is really a market for your product. What will change is, again, the cycle time once you launch. And then this is where sometimes you get a bit more innovative. So if you look at a company like Tesla as well, when they launched their cars, they really launched a computer with hardware on top of it. So they can really do a lot of tracking data. They're getting lots of data. They can change up the car. So the feature sets change and they can cater to the customer needs. So you have to build this culture of continuous innovation.
Awesome.
Yep.
So one final question, and I really request you, later to go through the feed and just quickly respond. But we'll take one more here. Smita asks, what are the most common mistakes while implementing Lean?
So I guess the most common one, and this is where, you mentioned kind of 2 books and the cycle time between them. I usually publish my books in my blogs first, but one of the topics that we are talking a lot about is even teams that think they are starting with customers and problems, we sometimes trick ourselves. I call it the hammer problem. Instead of asking what markets should we go into, what customer problems should we solve, we instead say, I want to build this hammer. Who will use my hammer and what problems does the hammer solve? So that's the hammer problem. And this was where we oftentimes will lead with sometimes a technology. We might say blockchain, IoT, whatever is out there, what can I do with this? And that's a bit of a challenge. It's not necessarily a mistake, but it's where we, again, put our biases and we think there's problem solving happening, but we have to be a bit more objective in that kind of testing. So I find that a lot of teams will cherry pick aspects of the framework, But we as humans are riddled with biases. We have lots of cognitive biases. If you look on Wikipedia, some 150 or 200 of them out there.
Yeah.
So just be aware that it's very easy to fool yourself, as Richard Feynman said, but we have to be careful not to do that. So that's where we find a lot of people tripping. So in the coaching that we do, a lot of it is really just pointing those out to people. And once they know they are tripping, they start thinking a bit differently. So.
Very good. Very good. Thank you so much. I think this has been a most insightful conversation. And where can people find you if they want to reach out to you? Twitter, or what's the best way to reach out? And also, I'm sure the website Lean Stack has lots of resources for people to go and understand this better, right?
Sure.
So,
Yeah. So I kind of put that on the page there. Down below is my email, and then that's my Twitter and LinkedIn kind of handle. So feel free to connect with me. So Twitter is definitely where I spend some time, but LinkedIn more so recently. And then Lean Stack is, yes, where you find a lot of these tools online along with some content. So you can definitely, if I piqued your interest, go ahead and check that out. There are a lot of resources there to use.
Awesome. Again, thank you so much, Ash, for joining us.